Great Britain and Germany are at war with each other again. Today is the day of victory in Europe. During most of the Second World War, it looked like the German war machine could not be stopped. But as it moved forward without stopping, it met losses in Russia and North Africa, followed by defeats in their own land in Europe, which led to their final defeat in May 1945. But when Nazi Germany fell, the tons of weapons that the Western Allies and the Soviets took had to be dealt with. Nazi items are now sold on the market, and some museums also have collections of them. But back then, the Nazi war machine could destroy whole towns. So, what really happened to all those German guns that were taken during the war? Let's find out. The war that changed the world forever. There were different things that were done with German weapons after the Second World War. They weren't just left behind. Before we go into more detail about how different countries dealt with the end of such a huge war, let's take a look at the war itself. Germany became a part of the Second World War when it invaded Poland in September 1939. This set off a chain of events that led to war around the world. Using blitzkrieg strategies, the Germans quickly took over Poland. So Britain and France, two rival European powers, went to war with the Nazi war machine. The following year, Germany took over a lot more land in Western Europe. In April, they took over Denmark and Norway, and by mid-year, they had also taken over the Low Countries and France. Germany's troops seemed unbeatable, and they even set up the Vichy government in the area to make sure they had full control. Berlin was involved in the Battle of Britain and the Balkans operation from 1940 to 1941. The German Luftwaffe tried to attack Britain from the air, but the Royal Air Force did better than them, making the Battle of Britain a complete failure. But by taking over Yugoslavia and Greece, Germany was able to increase its power in Southeast Europe. But Operation Barbarossa, which began in June 1941 to take over the Soviet Union, which was an ally at the time, was the most important event in the war. Even though there were some early wins, the effort ended up being very expensive, both in terms of money and people. The harsh winter in the Soviet Union and strong pushback started to hurt the German war machine. In the years between 1942 and 1943, the war turned sharply in favor of the Allies, while Germany suffered major setbacks. The Soviet Union won the Battle of Stalingrad, which was a major turning point in the war. At the same time, Western Allied forces made progress in North Africa, and in the end, the Axis forces gave up in Tunisia. As the war went on into 1944, Germany was fighting on two fronts. In the east, Soviet troops steadily moved west, taking back land that they had lost earlier in the war. In the west, the Allies launched an attack on Germany by landing in Italy. The Allied invasion of Normandy on D-Day set up a key beachhead in France. Germany's last big offensive in the Ardennes, called the Battle of the Bulge, failed to stop the Allied advance in the end. The next year, Soviet forces began their final attack on Berlin. This brought down the Nazi government and caused Hitler to kill himself in his bunker. Europe was no longer at war with the United States when Germany gave up without conditions on May 7, 1945. Still, there was the matter of the Nazi war machine, or more specifically, its parts. The Western Allies and the Soviet Union did use weapons they had taken from the Germans against the Nazis. Even during the war, it became very important to deal with the huge amounts of weapons, planes, tanks, ammunition, and other military equipment that were left over after the war. Using captured German weapons against the Nazi war machine. Soldiers on the front lines who were running low on supplies often used captured weapons and tools against the Nazi war machine. There were tanks and armored battle vehicles, AFVs, that did this the most. Of course, this worked both ways. Both the Allies and the Axis used enemy weapons to make their own armies stronger. Adding captured vehicles to the ranks of the German Wehrmacht was a planned and organized scheme. Before the war, they even took cars from countries they were occupying, like Austria and Czechoslovakia. They added captured tanks and AFVs to their units as they took over France, the Low Countries, and large parts of the Soviet Union. This helped fill in big holes in their battle plan, especially in the early parts of the war. The Western Allies, on the other hand, didn't need seized German tanks and other Axis vehicles as much. The Allies were able to replace lost equipment and equip new units without having to use enemy equipment that they had taken. Plus, adding foreign types of spare parts and ammo to their supply chains would have made things more difficult to manage. As long as the Allies didn't have access to German factories, it wasn't possible to use captured German cars. That doesn't mean that this trend didn't happen sometimes. After the war, the Allies started a big effort to take over and control Germany's huge arsenal of weapons. This had to be done to stop the spread of those weapons and keep things stable in Europe after the war, especially in Germany, where anti-Nazi feelings had not gone away totally even after the defeat. The Western Allies carefully organized and kept track of all the seized German weapons through a process called cataloguing. So, the Allies kept track of the types and amounts of weapons being used, made it easier to distribute them when needed, and stopped illegal arms trade. Of course, the winning Allies also had to deal with complicated decisions about how to handle and get rid of wartime assets. Managing the logistics of storing, transporting, and securing the seized weapons also proved to be difficult from an administrative point of view. A country's military power, strategic goals, and diplomatic agreements were also things they had to think about. But in general, the plan was to give each country weapons based on what it needed and how much it could help win the war. But even this wasn't easy. The fact that the Western Allies and the Soviets, who had just beaten a shared enemy, didn't trust each other made things a lot more difficult. As this war ended, the Cold War was about to begin. It was only natural that both new giants wanted to improve their armies and gain more power in Europe after the war. During and after the war, both sides took their fair share of the spoils. Germany had been split in two, just like the rest of Europe. Sir Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of Britain at the time, said it best when he said that an iron wall had come down over Europe. Spoils of war for the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union ended up using the most captured German weapons. They needed any kind of gear they could get to fight off the Nazis. Small groups and companies made up of stolen enemy tanks were put together. Soviet army orders said that seized tanks could be used as long as they could still work. A lot of the equipment that Soviet troops used to boost their own was taken from German troops. Things like boots, knives, mess kits, flashlights, and even personal things like shavers and sidearms were on this list. In the same way, German troops often looked for Soviet winter boots and hats. German troops used Soviet PPSH-41s, and Red Army troops used captured German MP-40s, so that there was even a swap of weapons. A lot of German Panzer III tanks and Stugee III assault guns were taken by Soviet forces after the Battle of Stalingrad in 1943. Over 100 of these trucks were rebuilt as Su-76I self-propelled guns after they were saved and fixed up. Soviet 20mm cannons were put on German command trucks that were based on Panzer I. They also used Panther tanks and Panzer IV medium tanks that used to belong to Germany. The Tiger I and II tanks, on the other hand, were mostly used for tests. German tanks like the Panther were highly valued for their fighting skills and were often kept in use longer than they were supposed to. Keeping captured tanks running in the field was hard because it was hard to get spare parts and ammo. The Eastern Front was very long, which made it hard to get captured supplies to groups that needed them. To keep friendly fire to a minimum, it was important to work together with friendly groups and aircraft. In order to do this, the troops often marked the tanks with Soviet symbols that could be seen. The equipment that was captured also gave useful information about the enemy's strengths and flaws. As part of operations to trick the Germans, Soviet units used Axis tanks to sneak up on their sights and attack them. During the war, the Soviets used a wide range of Axis vehicles and planes, from tanks like the Panzer IV to planes like the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and Junkers Ju 87. For background, all of this was happening at a time when the Soviets were caught off guard by the German attack and not ready to fight back, especially when it came to weapons. This practical approach helped them get the most out of their military during the war and finally drive the Germans out. Spoils of war for the Western Allies and resistance fighters in Europe. People who had taken weapons also used them against the Nazis, though not as much as the Western Allies did. One important case happened in North Africa, where the British Army ran out of new tanks. In March 1941, the British said they had 365 tanks ready to go, with about 60 of them being Italian medium-sized tanks that they had taken at Baie de Fomme. Even though these Italian tanks had been fixed up and given British radios, British tank crews didn't like them because they had weak armour and didn't work well mechanically. They got to Tobruk in February 1941, but their tanks were not with them. It was told to take over at Baie de Fomme from the Italian M1340 light tanks. With these Italian tanks, the unit was facing many problems by March 12th, such as power outages and getting too hot. Around 36 of the M13/40 tanks were still working by the end of March. By April, most of these tanks had been destroyed on purpose by the British. The captured enemy tanks were a very important addition to the Allies' troops, helping them keep working and stop the enemy from moving forward. During the war, units often took advantage of chances to use stolen enemy tanks to their advantage. These cases, on the other hand, are not recorded and are not well documented. Tanks that were captured were used until they broke down or ran out of ammo. Then they were destroyed so that they couldn't be taken back. A small number were looked at and rated by intelligence agencies before being sent back to the UK or the US for technical testing or to be put on show in museums. But not all of the captured cars were kept. When the Korean War was over, many of the German tanks that were taken at the Aberdeen Proving Ground were used for scrap metal. Soldiers who wanted to add to their weapons really wanted German tanks because they thought they were better. The Allies also used German half-tracks for other things, and they often added machine guns to them to make it easy to get more ammunition. In one well-known case, the Canadian Seaforth Highlanders captured a Panther in its entirety on the Italian front in October 1944. The tank was given the name Deserter and sent to the 145th Royal Armoured Corps to be tested against Sherman and Churchill tanks in their movement. The Panther tank, called Cuckoo, which was left behind during the battle for the village of Overloon, is another example that stands out. The 4th Battalion Coldstream Guards took Cuckoo as their own. It impressed them with its better sights and fighting skills. There were times when resistance forces also used captured tanks against Axis troops. During the 1944 Warsaw Uprising, Polish Home Army soldiers took German weapons, like tanks, to make their defenses stronger against Nazi troops. This shows how flexible and determined soldiers and resistance fighters are to complete their tasks even when things get tough. The wonder weapons. People have a lot of different ideas about what the so-called German wonder weapons were during the Second World War. Many people think that the fact that these advanced German technologies were not used right away could have changed the result of the war. Anyway, these weapons were pretty powerful and wouldn't have been able to save a Nazi area that was surrounded anyway. They took these weapons before they could be used against the other side because they were useful for study. Rocket fighters, jet fighters, cruise missiles and ballistic missiles were some of these new weapons. Back in the day, these advances worried the Allies because they knew that these new technologies could have military effects. Even though they were very advanced technologically, many of the German wonder weapons had big problems when they were used in battle. Nazi Germany was already losing, and money for study was running out. The Messerschmitt Me 163 rocket defender and the Me 262 turbojet plane are great examples of this issue. Both of these had problems with dependability and could be stopped by Allied forces. Even though the V-1 cruise missile and V-2 ballistic missile were very advanced technologically for their time, they did not have accurate guidance systems and did not have the strategic effect that was expected. Allied forces quickly changed how they protected the air to stop and deflect these missile strikes. Overall, the Allies' superiority in terms of people, resources and industrial ability had pretty much set the course of the war, making any possible benefits of such advanced weapons irrelevant. A lot of what people thought about the German wonder weapons and how they might have changed the war was shaped by propaganda. Nazi propaganda made over-the-top promises about how much better these weapons were than other weapons, which added to the myths surrounding them and made it harder to see how well they really worked in battle. One thing was different, though. Nazi Germany wanted to make an atomic bomb. To study nuclear weapons, they started a group called the Uranium Club, but they couldn't reach their goal before Germany was defeated in 1945. Because they didn't have enough resources, the science was hard, and the war was going on. The Allies were worried about the Nazis' work on the atomic bomb, which made them work even harder to beat the Nazis quickly. Also, the United States was making big steps forward in their own nuclear study with the Manhattan Project. What might have happened if Germany had used a nuclear weapon before the US? But when the war was over, Germany lost all of its weapons and was taken over by other countries, who then split it into West Germany and East Germany. Rebuilding West Germany's defenses. After the war, the Allies' policies toward Germany changed a lot, especially when it came to attempts to disarm and rearm Germany. At first, the Morgenthau Plan for 1945 wanted to turn Allied-occupied Germany into a pre-industrial state by breaking down its weapons and important businesses. During the first 3 years of rule, the US and UK worked hard to get Germany to give up its weapons. But this strategy lost support over time and went against the goals of the 1948 Marshall Plan, which was meant to boost industrial growth. West Germany got a lot of money from the Marshall Plan, which helped rebuild infrastructure, bring back industries, and help people get back on their feet. Together with the establishment of democratic institutions, these efforts made it possible for West Germany to become an economic powerhouse in Europe after the war. With the building of the Berlin Wall in 1961, tensions between East and West became very clear during the Cold War. The wall made things worse between the democratic West and the communist East, and over time it came to represent injustice. Still, the desire for freedom led to protests and efforts to escape. In the end, the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 was a turning point in history. It meant that the Soviet Union was no longer in charge of Eastern Europe and made it possible for Germany to be reunited in 1990, which restored the country's independence. After World War II, neither East nor West Germany had organized armies. While this was true before the Soviet Union dropped the RDS-1 atomic bomb in 1949 and the Korean War started in 1950, things changed. When communism grew, Western Europe had to rethink its defense needs. The Chancellor of West Germany, Konrad Adenauer, wanted to get West Germany back to being independent. Even though there was doubt at first, West Germany's plan to join NATO and its willingness to work together eventually won support. West Germany joined NATO in 1955, which was a big step toward its reintegration into the international military community. With help from the US military assistance program, the Bundeswehr, West Germany's military, was also rearmed and given more soldiers to help defend Europe. The US gave back former Kriegsmarine ships that were taken by the Tripartite Naval Commission. West German troops went through a lot of training and were stationed on US Navy ships. The goal of this partnership was to give West Germany a strong navy. At first, Chancellor Adenauer's budget called for limited air power. However, leaders of the US Air Force pushed for a bigger Luftwaffe that was more like the US Air Force. Because of this, a small air force was created to help with activities on the ground. West Germany planned to have as many as 500,000 men in the military, which would be more than France's army. In order to reach this goal, steps were taken like turning the Bundesgrenzschutz, the federal border guard, into military troops and starting the draft. Some people were worried about a return of German militarism and the political effects that might have, but many former German soldiers thought that there could be no future German army without restoring the Wehrmacht. Adenauer agreed to their requests, which included freeing war criminals who had been jailed and stopping the slandering of German soldiers. On November 12, 1955, Adolf Heusinger and Hans Speidel were sworn into the brand new Bundeswehr. This was the start of the West German Navy, which is now called the Bundesmarine. Adenauer also set up the Blank Office, or Amt Blank, to get more sovereignty for West Germany by using its military contributions. At first, France was against West Germany's plans to rearm its navy, but Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe put pressure on France to give in. Even though West Germany rearmed, its military was still controlled by the Supreme Allied NATO, which limited its command posts. Along with the 1951 Treaty of Paris, the growth of the Bundeswehr strengthened economic cooperation in Western Europe and brought West Germany into the European community after the war. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, used this as an excuse to control Eastern European states militarily and politically through the Warsaw Pact. Global impact of captured German weapons. An important amount of Nazi military equipment, such as tanks, small arms and rockets, was tested and studied by the Allies. This gave them information about how the Germans were improving their technology and fighting strategies. But almost all of the German equipment was thrown away and used for metal. It was amazing how many planes were scrapped. Between 1945 and 1946, thousands of planes were scrapped at places like Kingman Air Force Base in Arizona. A lot of the weapons were kept by the Soviet Union as prizes. Weapons from the Second World War can still be seen rusting away in fields and woods all over the country that used to be the USSR. Some things were broken in war, but others were just left behind and forgotten. Because France had to quickly rebuild its military, it used captured German Panther tanks to equip a tank company until 1949, when the ARL-44 heavy tank took their place. In the same way, Lebanon bought SM-79 bombers from Italy, but they quickly broke down because they weren't maintained well and were old. It was surprising that different Arab countries kept using German Panzer IV tanks and Stu-3 attack guns in the 1967 Six-Day War. In the same way, Israel used a lot of German weapons when it was first starting out, including fake Bf-109 planes. After the war, there was also a thriving black market trade where extra weapons were sold to small countries that wanted to improve their defense. German small guns, which are known for their precise engineering, were first widely used around the world because they were easy to get after the war. But the US military quickly improved its technology, with some help from German engineers and scientists that were taken. Soon, many German designs were no longer useful. This change can be seen in the V-1 Loon, which was reverse-engineered by the US. Even though the Germans were thought to have better combat power, by early 1945, Allied technological progress was picking up speed. A lot of the German armor that wasn't used ended up in the hands of owners and museums, where it was shown off in shows and sometimes fixed up for personal use. Even with all of these attempts, a lot of German tanks were destroyed. Because of a lack of spare parts and the release of more modern British, American and Soviet tanks, the German tanks became less useful over time. Preservation and ethical considerations. It is very important for museums to keep history alive and teach people about what happened in the Second World War. By putting together exhibits and keeping objects safe, Museums give us important information about how complicated wartime was. They help people understand the historical background better by using interactive displays and educational programs. Private collectors have also kept wartime items safe, so they won't be lost over time. Their work often goes hand in hand with museums, giving people more ways to learn about history and get involved with it. But keeping and showing off German war weapons brings up moral questions that need to be carefully thought through. These items are more than just pieces of history. They are also reminders of a dark time in human history. Putting them up without the right context or care can make violence look good and spread damaging ideas. There has been a big rise in the market for buying and selling Nazi memorabilia in recent years. This is partly because soldiers have been dying and their families are trying to get rid of their belongings. But many people in the public disagree with and criticize this trend. They think that selling Nazi artifacts for money is offensive and disrespectful. People and companies that sell these kinds of things have been criticized for making money off of symbols from one of history's darkest times. Some collectors are only interested in the history and style of Nazi artifacts, while others are known to support hate groups and neo-Nazism. This has caused arguments about whether or not it is moral to trade in Nazi artifacts. More specifically, Jewish groups have spoken out against the sale and buying of these kinds of items for fun, saying that they might glorify or downplay the horrible crimes that were done during the Holocaust. The Holocaust was when the Nazi regime killed 6 million Jews, as well as Romani people, Poles, disabled people, and other people they thought were undesirable. Some Jewish people think that certain Nazi artifacts are important to history and should be kept so that people don't forget what happened in the Holocaust. There are different laws in each country that say you can't sell Nazi relics. Some places in Europe, like France, don't let these kinds of things be sold at all. Auction sites like eBay have rules that say you can't sell some things that have Nazi symbols or propaganda on them. This is to stop people from glorifying war crimes and crimes against humanity. Even with all of these attempts, the market for Nazi memorabilia still causes moral and legal problems. In addition, there are moral concerns about where these objects came from. It is very important to make sure that things in private or public collections were legally and morally gathered, without glorifying war or taking advantage of people's pain. Clear records of where these items came from and their histories are important for upholding moral standards when preserving and showing off German war weapons. In any case, taking German weapons and the damage caused by the Second World War had a huge impact on politics and science in the years after the war. It sped up the race to build more powerful weapons between the US and the USSR, which led to progress in missile technology, jet propulsion, and other areas. The Nazis' Wonder Weapons program also led to new scientific discoveries and helped create modern rocketry and aerospace engineering, even though it didn't change the result of the war. These relics teach us about the terrible things that happened during the war and hate that killed millions. We hope you liked this video. Watch another video here.